It should be noted that, with the ascension of Caesar Froza and the abolition of the Houses of Parliament, the position of the Král and the role of the royal house was further minimized. Essentially, as succession continued and Králs were to be crowned, their role was to live lives of elegance and luxury in gentlemanly society, their most important function being to serve as hosts for foreign diplomats and occupiers of the powerless throne, so pretenders couldn't use it as a cudgel against the universally recognized power in Romania, General Froza. As such, the lineage and ascension of Králs will no longer be recorded, and it is generally accepted that while Král Stefan was not Romania's last Král, he was indeed its last monarch. Meanwhile, in Andalusia, their lagging economy became too much for the people to bear, and they fell to a communist revolution, soon forcing their puppet Java to undergo revolution as well. Throughout 1914, more reforms made their way down from the Iron Guard government. Most notably, a system of ethnic purity was enacted known as the Écusson de Sange, meaning the blood badge. This blood badge was issued to those who had been investigated by the government and proven to be true Romanians by way of a familial paper trail or a eugenic medical examination. The badge was a small sewn patch depicting a black shield with a drop of blood in the center. Those with the badge affixed it to their passports and were entitled to certain benefits. They could attain government jobs and were entitled to things like government-sponsored pensions, universal health care, and positions above officer in the Romanian military. Those without the badge, such as gypsies, amesticati, and heretics like Massalians or Bogomilists, lost their last name and were assigned new ones from a government-approved list, comprising roughly 20 surnames in total. They were also tattooed on the back of their left hand between their thumb and forefinger with a black star about an inch square. Those who bore the Stea Strina, the foreign star, who weren't permitted access to public transport, had to pay for their health care through a complicated labor-based certificate program, were subjected to tax increases up to 10% for each child they had, and were mandated to move into one of the 8 landlocked provinces which comprised eastern and western Siebenbürgen no later than January 29, 1922. The government began the construction of these vast ghettos promptly in January of 1915 and resettled any Romanians living there to the north or to Bucharest, providing compensation to them. 3.3 million people were to receive the Stea Strina, and tens of thousands attempted to flee. The Manamorti were stationed at every legal crossing point in Romania, with orders to arrest anybody who would have to receive the tattoo according to their passport. Greeks, Ukrainians, and Jews, though not targeted by the government's policies, could still not qualify for the Écusson de Sange in the usual way, and the policy regarding them was that they were to be treated without fear or favor. They could attain the blood badge via an exceptional national service, the foreign star via criminal proceedings, and either at the discretion of the government. On the 8th of July, 1914, Romania invaded easterly Wallachia, the birthplace of communism and beneath a socialist government, with 120,000 men. The Republic of Bavaria, their only ally, refused to honor their alliance with them and abandoned the small nation to their fate. By November, easterly Wallachia had become a puppet of Romania, where the more experimental reforms of their fascist government would be given their first field testing. In March of 1915, as the military continued to grow, Romania invaded Zaporozhye with 96,000 men. Without allies, the small secondary power was quick to fall. Later that month, 36,000 communists declared open rebellion in East and West Siebenbürgen, retarding the progress of the ghettos. By July, Zaporozhye was puppeted and the communists were put down. By late 1915, Romania had designs on Wallachia, stationing roughly 200,000 men on the border. Still, Romania couldn't make any decisions to invade while they were allied with France and Mazandaran. Meanwhile, January 1st marked the start of the January Revolution in Wallachia, spurred by over 500,000 farmers dissatisfied at the dysfunctional, corrupt government which feverishly invested in the cities, leaving the countryside to rot. The new proletarian dictatorship under chairman Silviu Zatu raised their crimson banner proudly bearing a black star as a direct reference, insult, and challenge to neighboring Romania. Chairman Zatu, a former lawyer and also an ethnic amesticati, gave a speech on February 1st in the border province of Bor, close enough for the 66,000 men of the 20th Romanian Legion to hear him. He said that only a few miles over the border, the Romanian menace was building cities of death, frothing at the mouth to shed the blood of innocent workers. The squat, bearded 60-year-old in his round glasses shouted with the conviction of a young man that General Froza was a superstitious, bigoted fool, and how he wishes the flames that licked his house that day had taken him also. He said that the workers' revolution could not be stopped, and now it was knocking at Romania's front door. When the people storm your rotten shores, you will not be long to put a coward's bullet through your black brain. On the 3rd of February, the Socialist People's Republic of Wallachia, or SPRW, broke off their alliances with monarchist France and Mazandaran in favor of solidarity with Andalusia and Egypt. Luckily for Romania, those allies were far, far weaker than the ones they had decided to abandon out of principle. On December 24, 1916, Romania invaded Wallachia with the full force of its armies, nearly 500,000 men. The Wallachian Red Army invaded through the south, taking much of Rumelia and allowing thousands of ghetto-bound underclasses to escape into Wallachia. The Romanian army focused on the north exclusively and annexed Transdanubia within the year, and allowed the Romanian minority there to migrate along the supply line into Romania. By 1917, the Wallachian hold in the south was beginning to break under fire from Zaporozhian and easterly forces. Eventually, their line was shattered and they retreated. However, once the Wallachian military made its way back behind their own borders, civilian industry had constructed a system of deep trenches and landmined earth, making any more inroads impossible. Froza decided to leave with a victory before this turned into a quagmire, and the Romanian War for the Liberation of Transdanubia was won with the full annexation of Transdanubia from Wallachia. This cut them off from their northernmost region, southern Austria proper, entirely. Immediately, Romanian military engineers set to work on new military pieces and trench warfare devices like shotguns and flamethrowers to prepare for the next conflict with Wallachia. Meanwhile, the communist scientists of Wallachia were making their own deadly innovations that would aim to kill the seemingly endless Romanian infantry charges before they ever even reached the trenches. Things like poison gas, razor wire, state-of-the-art shrapnel landmines, and prototype claymores. The next war promised to be impossibly deadly, and both countries were willing to do whatever it takes to win. On the 3rd of February 1920, France offered Romania an alliance, which Romania accepted. Froza lorded this over Zatu and his feckless idealism. Meanwhile, Turkestan fell to a communist revolution, becoming the ACCP. Brazil would also fall to communism later that year. Meanwhile, a very odd series of events occurred. The communist government of Wallachia, in order to save face, sent a large shipment of raw materials in an attempt to ally itself with France once more, seeing and recognizing its own folly. France also puppeted Egypt. At that same time, the Papal States forged an alliance with the Republic of Bavaria, as well as Scandinavia and Ingria. Then France declared an offensive war into the Papal States with the intent of taking the interior thereof, calling all its allies into the conflict. Suddenly, Europe was consumed with war, and Romania was technically fighting on the same side as Wallachia and Egypt. This arrangement meant that there was fighting on every continent once again, and the Second Great War had begun in the blink of an eye. Romania was spiteful to have been dragged into this war, and stationed defensive measures along all their exposed borders, refusing to lose men in a frivolous offensive. By January of 1921, Romania had invented the light tank, intended to be used to relieve cavalry, allowing them to make inroads into the Papal States if they so desired. The Romanian generals, as it turned out, were too tempted by this opportunity to experiment with new military hardware, and so launched an offensive against the Papal States. This proved to be wildly effective, as when Bavaria took Paris on the 4th of January, Romanian forces threatened Rome by the same date. This resulted in a rather anticlimactic white peace and a truly short war. Still, the war coupled with rebel action caused the Siebenbürgen ghettos to be finished late, in May instead of January, and revised the racial laws so that the bearers of the Stea Strina were to be relocated no later than January 1st, 1923. Around this time, Wallachia was caught up by its ideology and returned to a full-fledged communist foreign policy, returning exclusively to its proletarian allies. On the 17th of June 1925, Romania invaded yet again, with the aim of taking the central Hungarian region from Wallachia. Using light armor divisions as the forward vanguard of the invading force, General Froza's hopes were that his forces could smash through their front lines like a sledgehammer before they would be able to properly man their trenches. By February 26, 1926, central Hungary was occupied, but any further advance was suicide as the rear trench defenses had already been manned. As such, Wallachia in central Hungary was ceded to Romania, and the Second Romano-Wallachian War ended in the fascists' favor. In January of 1928, Asturias seceded from Andalusia, mainly peopled by persecuted Catholics and monarchists that sought help from the Pope, which did not provide it but was ultimately not needed. In 1929, Deccan reformed peacefully from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional republic, joining the ranks of Bavaria and the Republic of Wu in so doing. By March of that year, the loss of so many Romanian workers in the form of the undesirables caused the economy to contract to a certain degree, even sparking Jacobin protests in the west and communist insurgencies in the south. General Froza approached this descent as he always had, with wanton force. Meanwhile, given that Caesar Froza was 70, many in the government frequently discussed plans for who would take power upon his death, and how they would rule. Froza forbade his government ministers from speaking about such a matter in his presence, and told them to treat him as though he would never die. Of course they did, because they valued their lives. Meanwhile, in 1932, in the east, Qinghai became a fascist dictatorship, and Tibet was freed from the grip of Jaunpur by the military actions of the Republic of Wu. On the early morning of the 1st of January 1936, General Caesar Froza looked out over the city of Bucharest with the knowledge that his armies were doing battle. His Mata Morti were putting down communist and Jacobin rebels across Romania, and doing it well. He remembered the story of his life, and how he came to be at the helm of his homeland, leading it into a future of honor and glory. Suddenly, he collapsed, and nearby attendants rushed the 76-year-old to the nearest hospital. There it was clear he suffered a massive heart attack, and the bed he lay in would be his deathbed. He demanded the government historian, descended from the generational scribes of old, attend to him in his final moments and hear what he had to say. He took his shoulder and brought him down to his level, uncannily strong for an old man in the throes of death. He told him of the visions God gave him of the future. He told him of how he saw the black boots of the Mata Morti marching across Europe and eventually tread even the stars underfoot. He told him of how he saw a bright future for his people, and how in that future he saw only Romanians, no heretic or unclean, useless breather. He saw no Amesticati, no gypsies, no Bogomilists or Massalians. He told him that future was the destiny of the nation, and that there was truth in the blood. The hand that gripped the historian's shoulder to the point of bruising went limp at that instant, and the honored father of fascism slumped over, dead. The room was consumed with a thick air of apprehension and mourning. Nobody knew how to go on without him, and it almost seemed like the old man couldn't, in fact, die such a mortal death. Someone would have to take his place, and in order to determine that, the historian took it upon himself to call the government together for the 5th National Council at the Royal Palace in Bucharest. This was the beginning of a new age, and they would need someone who had history in their veins to make the next step, to determine who would fill Froza's boots, and use them to tread out the enemies of the Romanian blood like chaff from the wheat. Sanguinem vero.